Okay, so we know that there have been recent developments. We normally don't do programs this late in the year. We had some news come out from the Middle East. There's always stuff happening there that is very critical, not only in the region but also globally. And Syria is one of those areas that we have seen a lot of developments recently. Dr. Lesch, before we begin into the relationship that you developed with Bashar al-Assad, can you give us a brief synopsis about the recent developments that have taken shape in the last 3 weeks or so in Syria?
Brief, I don't know about brief, but I mean, obviously, a coalition led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which means the Organization for the Liberation of the Levant or Syria, that basically ruled over this province in northwest Syria called Idlib, which they actually a earlier iteration of HTS and their allies had taken over in 2015. And they went on the offensive, which, a couple of weeks ago, which at first most believe was just more of a defensive operation. The operation was known or called by them as Operation Deter Aggression, which appears to be more defensive than offensive. And then essentially what happened is once they started meeting uh, Syrian armed forces and so forth, the Syrian armed forces just melted away for the most part, and they went way beyond, I think, even their expectations by taking the city of Aleppo. And once that fell, it was like a house of cards. And then they kept advancing southward, and of course, moved into Damascus within the last week. And the regime, the government of Bashar al-Assad fell. And Bashar al-Assad, the long-serving president since 2000, and the guy that I met with a number of times early in his time in power. He left Syria, and so we're in a very interesting, challenging, unstable, chaotic period that offers a great deal of hope to many, but also, there are a great many perils that lie ahead where things could unravel in Syria quickly. So everyone, I think, is international community, local groups, NGOs, the United Nations, et cetera, are trying very hard to see where this is going and to help, for the first and foremost, to bring aid and comfort to a long-suffering Syrian population. So that's the 5-second note.
So and I have some follow-ups about that, but I want to get to this unique opportunity that we have with Dr. Lesch, who is by all means, I guess you could say, the guru of Middle East politics, and you've advised so many presidents and administrations. You had this unique opportunity to meet with Bashar al-Assad and knew him for over 5 years. How did that happen? How did you get to know him, and what were your first impressions of him?
First of all, thank you for promoting me to the guru of Middle East politics. I appreciate that. Um, Second, I started meeting Bashar al-Assad in 2004 and then through 2009. I first met with him because I proposed writing a book on him and modern Syria through a mutual friend who I'd known for years, and I'd been traveling for many, many years to Syria. And he brought some, and especially a lot of academics I knew, and he brought some of these people into the government. And through one particular person, I approached him about writing this book. Long story short, in 2004, I got the green light and I was invited to Damascus. And I met with Bashar al-Assad, Asma al-Assad, the First Lady, and many other officials repeatedly in 2004 and 2005 until the book came out. And then continued to meet with him as something of an unofficial liaison between the United States and Syria because Syrian-U.S. relations were strained, to say the least, following the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. So it was something of a lifeline between Damascus and the United States. And at Bashar al-Assad's request, he wanted me to keep coming in. And then briefly, we, as part of the Abraham Path Initiative, which has established 2,000 kilometers of walking trails throughout the Middle East. We tried to do that in Syria, and I worked with the president's office and others, and unsuccessfully, but it was quite the adventure. And one of the things, and people that are tuning in right now, what I'm about to say doesn't reconcile with your popular perception of Bashar al-Assad, because when I met with him, and there are a couple of people on that I know that also met with Bashar al-Assad during this period who I think can confirm my observations, is that he was always very polite, mild-mannered, somewhat awkward, a computer nerd, and even self-deprecating at time. Much different than what the perception is now. In fact, I know a lot of diplomats who met with, at the time, who met with guys like Saddam Hussein in the past, Muammar Gaddafi, more notorious Middle East dictator, so to speak, than Bashar. And they all said the same thing. Bashar was just a different cat. He was fairly normal, almost too normal, a nice guy. And that's why a lot of people, including myself, if I have a hard time reconciling that profile with what we know today or what he became. And the thing that I tell a lot of people, the first time I met him, after the niceties and introduction, I said, Mr. President, the worst thing you ever did was made it known to the West that you like Phil Collins music and the music of the Electric Light Orchestra, because it raised these expectations that because he studied ophthalmology in London for 18 months, because he liked the technological toys of the West, because he liked Western music, that he would be this reforming pro-West leader. And inside Syria, they had a great deal of hope as well. But what I tell people is that, look, 18 months in London and so forth doesn't counter being a child of the Arab-Israeli conflict, being a child of the superpower Cold War, being a child of the tumult in Lebanon over the years, and most importantly, being a child of his father, Hafez al-Assad, who ruled Syria from 1970 to 2000. Then Bashar took over. Those are the factors and elements and historical experiences that shaped his worldview, and can help you understand some of the policies he enacted from there on out.
Sounds like intriguing figure. He went into. Was there? Did you feel there was an expectation because he went into the sciences and became an ophthalmologist that he may eventually replace his father? Was he more interested in the sciences than in politics?
His first love was ophthalmology. He was not destined for the throne. His older brother, who was being groomed, died in a car accident in 1994. And then Bashar was whisked home from London, where he was essentially getting board certification in ophthalmology. And then he was groomed and given more responsibility, more important profiles, to the point where he was able to take power. And the thing that is interesting about Bashar. Again, many people ask me, because I guess I saw him more than anybody in the West over those years, usually seeing him 3 or 4 times a year and for long periods of time, is did you see this coming? Were there any indications that he would turn out to be what many view as a brutal dictator as the Civil War began in 2011? And the thing that I like to point out is that Roger Owen is a terrific scholar at Harvard University, wrote this book back in 2012, I think, called The Rise and Fall of Arab Presidents for Life. And he talked about these alternative realities that are constructed around these authoritarian leaders, surrounded by sycophants, yes men who praise the great leader and so forth. And that has an effect on this particular leader, and it affects how they see the world, how they see their own population, how they see and assess the nature of threat. And it was driven home to me personally when I visited with him in 2007 in May or June, when it was his first reelection. In Syria, the president serves 7 years. He came in 2000. This was his first reelection campaign. And it's not really, it's been described as a sham. It's not really legitimate. It's a referendum, yes, no. There's only one person running, Bashar al-Assad. And the night before I was to meet with him, I arrived and I was mulling about. There were all these parades and bands playing and signs in English. I love Bashar all over the place in Syria the night before. And I went to some polling booths, and again, they were not private polling booths. There was mukhabarat, Syrian security, all around. I could see them. There was pro-Bashar bands playing. So it'd be the intrepid voter who would tick the no box for Bashar. So I met with him the next day, next morning, he got the results of the election. I think he won 97 point something percent of the vote. And, I asked him, I said, what do you think about that? And the guy that I had gotten to know and struck a rapport with to some degree, I expected him to be that self-deprecating person, almost say, well, that doesn't mean anything. You have to look at voter turnout. And I know it's somewhat constructed and not legitimate. But he sat back and said, they love me. The people love me. And that's at that moment in my own mind. I didn't say this verbally, but in my own mind, that's when I knew he drank the Kool-Aid of power, that he was going to be president for life or as long as he could be president. And so, many of us had hoped he would change the system early on. And there were attempts early on, in the first year or two that didn't really go very far. Uh, but instead, the system changed him. He assimilated into the system. And that night, the personality cult that his father had, that Bashar eschewed, the pomp and circumstance that he did away with when he came to power, it all returned in full force. And I think that told me a great deal about where he was and how he became much more comfortable with power at that time. He was awkward with it in the beginning and didn't have the people he wanted around him, but he eventually got the people he had, his loyalists around him, and now he was more comfortable with power. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it's an authoritarian system, so you're much more comfortable being an authoritarian leader. So that's when I saw this transition.
And to extend on that a little bit, to kind of getting into his mind, what do you think is running through his mind in as he's sitting in Moscow right now?
Wondering what happened. I think he's somewhat in shock. He came out with a statement that is trying to construct his own narrative events to counter what other people are saying, which is not very complimentary of him and how he left Damascus and Syria. He must be shocked because again, this alternative reality, I'm sure, continued into the Civil War, and he developed, this clear sense of triumphalism as he went on in his years in office. He survived the 2005 assassination of former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri in Lebanon, which was blamed on Syria at first. And everyone at the time thought his days were numbered. But he not only survived, he actually improved his position domestically in Damascus, even though he lost some ground in Lebanon. In 2013, his Damascus was virtually surrounded by a coalition of opposition groups with only one road leading into Damascus. I know because I took that road with some other people on a conflict resolution mission to meet with the Syrian officials at the time. And yet he emerged from that with Iranian and Hezbollah help. In 2015, ISIS was on the rise. It took, Palmyra, which is, a oasis city in Syria, east of Homs. It's an important tourist site. And the opposition, for one of the few times, had gotten its act together in terms of a unified command and control structure. That's when they took Idlib, as I mentioned earlier. And again, people were saying his days are numbered. But he survived that because the Russians came in full force, and the Russian Air Force essentially became the Syrian Air Force. And then, of course, he survived, retook some of the major cities like Aleppo by 2016. And then in the last few years, he has been rehabilitated in the region and even somewhat internationally. He was allowed back into the Arab League in 2023. A number of Arab states had reestablished diplomatic relations in Damascus. So it seemed that things were normal. And so he could look at this and say, I survived again. And this is the thing about Syria. And again, some of the people on know and have dealt with the Syrian government in the last few decades is that they always think they can punch above their weight. And this is the government of the Assads. They think they can punch above their weight diplomatically. They think they have much more leverage than they actually do. And they always think they can wait out anybody. That time is on their side and circumstances will change to their advantage, or that they'll strategically recede into the background and just simply survive. And it's happened on numerous occasions. It happened under his father, Hafiz al-Assad, on a few occasions. And so this led Assad, in this Bashar al-Assad, I think, to not take any chances. because, such as Turkey and its president, Erdogan, had been making overtures, serious and public overtures toward Damascus to reestablish perhaps diplomatic relations in the last year or two, rebuffed by Assad because he sat and he gave conditions, and I wouldn't do this until certain conditions were met. And so he waited and waited. He thought he was in a position of leverage, and he was not at all, as was shown. And in one sense, Erdogan just said, well, enough of this. I'll countenance the HTS onslaught, and it keeps going and going, and Turkey's the big winner. That's just one case of that. And so, in that sense, his triumphalism that he developed helped him get through some things, certainly from his point of view. But it established this paradigm of stubbornness, of status quo, that the world will come to him, and things will be okay eventually. And of course they weren't.
And you mentioned how he's probably surprised sitting in Moscow. Did it surprise you?
Um, I wish I could say no, but it was not shocking to me. It was a bit surprising, especially the speed with which the Syrian government and its forces fell. I think it surprised everybody. As I said earlier, I think it surprised HTS coalition on how far they could advance, and they kept going and going and going. But if you really look at Syria, again, on the surface, from the outside, it seemed as if they were, making some advances and again being rehabilitated in the region, even internationally. If you look inside over the last few years, especially the last year or so, there were a lot of small-scale protests starting to arise, and not so small-scale protests in places like Suwaida and Daraa in the south, and in other cities, and even in areas that were known as pro-Assad bastions in the northwest, because they simply weren't getting anything. They were living a terrible and horrible life. Very few, if any, were willing to keep what existed in power. You know, the economy was in a shambles after over a decade of destructive civil war and crippling international sanctions. Even more corruption than existed before the Civil War began in 2011. You had rapacious warlords, lack of basic services. It was, 90% of the country under the poverty line, no employment, pretty much, except in the war economy. And it was essentially what I've been saying this recently, a car without an engine. It was stuck in the mud, can't go anywhere. And who's going to fight to keep that, especially when, the only ones that are making any sort of decent living are the privileged few who are tied to the government, who are involved in what had become, essentially a narco state. So no one's gonna want that. It reminds me a little bit of this welcoming so far of HTS. Reminds me a little bit of Afghanistan in the 90s, following the Soviet invasion and occupation. And Afghanistan it was simply a mess. It was awful. And so the population welcomed this very extreme and, in a sense, probably more extreme than HTS group called the Taliban. And they didn't agree with them for the most part. They didn't like their version of Islam for the most part, but they did restore order. They put the lights on. And by that point, that's all that people wanted. And I think at this point, that's all that people want now. If you can restore order, if you can keep the lights on, if you can provide food and basic services, we'll give you a shot. And the Assad government hadn't been able to do that. And so no one was willing to fight to keep that system in power.
Kind of diving into the you're talking about the people, and we've seen there are a lot of videos floating around of prisons and people who have they have no windows. They're incarcerated in underground tunnels and whatnot. Um, how do you think this level of repression developed? You kind of answered it, but in your conversations with him, were there any moments that you
Yeah,
discussed those topics, and how was his
yeah,
response to it?
yeah. In fact, another story in November 2007, I again went to Damascus to meet with him. the day before when I arrived. Usually, there was a contingent from the president's office who met me and whisked me through customs and went to a VIP room and then chauffeured me to the hotel. It was all very nice and cool. This one occasion that didn't happen. It happened once before, no big deal. So I went to customs and they said I was on the blacklist. To make a long story short, I was interrogated at one of these rooms with no windows at San Antonio, excuse me, at Damascus International Airport by the Air Force Intelligence, which is the most feared and most powerful of all the intelligence agencies in Syria at that time. And, it actually ended in a fairly funny story. But the next morning, when I saw President Bashar, as he usually does, he asked me, "How was your trip?" And I said, "Well, other than the 3 hour interrogation, it was fine." And he was aghast. He was looked around. He said, "Find out what happened. How did this happen?" And all this. So he was apologetic. And we had established enough of a rapport by this time. I looked at him and I said, "Mr. President, unless you get control of these guys, they're going to come back and haunt you." And by these guys, I meant Syrian security, the Mukhabarat. And that was somewhat prophetic because the fuel that lit the fire of the revolution in Syria was when teenagers in Daraa were tortured by Syrian security after they had written anti-regime graffiti on some walls in the city. And so I asked him this, and he responded. He goes, "I know that they engage in excesses, but I need them. This is a dangerous neighborhood and I need them. I have to give them some leeway." And I should have said, "Well, no, you don't have to give them some leeway," but that's was his mindset. It was a concession to them that he needed them. And they had done some things for him to keep him in power. That's a subject of another story. Not that they had power over him. If he said, "I want this done," it will get done. But that was always a consideration. And so his mindset, I think, was that, the ends justify the means. And as I said earlier, this alternate reality, he began to equate the well-being of the country with his well-being, and that he was actually saving a way of life and the people, in the beginning of the Civil War. And the thing is, once you make these concessions to that sort of thing, it multiplies. And it was more business as usual because this had been going on in Syria under his father as well. And of course, it multiplied by many times during the Syrian Civil War because of the nature of war at that time. So it's something that, again, hard to reconcile with this person. And I was reading something today and I met with all of his colleagues at the Western Eye Hospital in London when he was studying before he became president. They all say he was so nice, so humble. You never know that he was the son of the Syrian president. But that old saying, "Absolute power corrupts absolutely," is a cliche for a reason. And I certainly saw this happening during the time I met him, and clearly it happened even more after the Civil War began.
Mm. Um, what do you think as we're looking ahead? What do you think? There's some obvious challenges that not only a new government faces, but the people face in this change of rule. What are some of the challenges that will confront Syria? And then also the leader who is the al-Jilani, I believe is his
Mhm.
name.
Mhm.
What do you know about him, and how do you think? He's got ties, I believe, to Al Qaeda, although he's distanced himself and his group. What do you think his role is going to be?
Well, he's the power broker right now. He has led HTS for a long time and its previous iterations. Jabhat al-Nusra was known for a long time. And of course, for a while, it was the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. And as you said, he and his group has tried to distance themselves from al-Qaeda. Look, I mean, transition from revolution to ruling is never an easy process. As I just indicated, HTS has rebranded itself several times and they're doing and saying the right things right now. But many people will ask, has the tiger really, changed its stripes? There are a bunch of journalists in Idlib right now, which has been under the control of primarily HTS, but some other groups, and Turkey has had a role since 2015. And so they're in Idlib and saying, okay, who are these guys? How did they rule? Are they okay? And it's interesting, the responses. I mean, they range from one guy who said, well, they're better than ISIS. Well, that's a pretty low bar, if that's your calculation. And then there are others that said, well, they provided basic services, something I was saying earlier. They kept the lights on, they were plugged into the Turkish grid, so they were better able to keep the lights on than the Syrian government was. They provided basic services. But then there are others that said, they were pretty much just as authoritarian as the Syrian government was, but with a more Islamic veneer, and that they're very hardline Sunni Muslims. But on the other hand, it seems that they are listened to, or they respond to pressure from a population, and I assume probably the Turks at times, because they had what was a morality police trying to enforce modest dress and making sure people, weren't playing songs in cafes or something, stuff like that. And because of popular pressure, some protests, they dropped that. But they have their history with repression, authoritarianism. I hope that what they're saying and doing right now is will be what will happen in the future. International acceptance is vital, and that will provide a moment of leverage, I think, for the international community, the United Nations, and others to ensure that this new entity that comes into being is non-sectarian, inclusive, and protects the rights of minorities, protects the rights of women, and basic human rights in general. More importantly is this. I mean, this is, again, they can't go too fast too soon. You look at the example of the Sudan, and again, I know there are a couple of people on here that can relate to this. The Sudan got rid of in 2019 a long-serving dictator, Omar al-Bashir, who had been ruling since 1989. They, by an opposition coalition, they, they enacted a transitional government. They started a constitutional process, and look where it is now. It all went to hell. So, you have to be very, very careful, and things can break down. I think one of the important things is getting as much as possible the HTS, hardcore military out of it. Perhaps even Ahmed al-Sharaa, which is his real name, and his nom de guerre was Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, out of it, at least on the surface, at some point. There will be a political process, presumably in about 3, 4, 6 months or so. The UN and my good friend Geir Pedersen, the UN Special Envoy to Syria, is there right now trying to shepherd this transition. So there's a lot of things that you can't do too much too fast. I think the simpler the better. A simple declaration of principles that guides this process forward, and down the road, then they'll get more specific and exactly what type of governance system do they want. It's going to be decentralized. It's just how much. Is it going to be asymmetrical decentralization, a la Iraq, which I would guard against? Will it be federal regions like UAE, which I would guard against as well? But some sort of balance between a representative centralized government and decentralization has to be found. That will be done over the course of time. But I think the important thing, Armin, and during the Civil War, I led this one conflict resolution initiative, and we met with over 100 opposition guys. Some of them are probably in Damascus right now with the new system, with the new organization there. And as well as Syrian officials. We met with them just in Gaziantep, just north of Syria. We met with them in northern Syria. We met with them all around the region and in Syria itself. These were the guys that were fighting and dying in Syria, not the exiles in the international community. And one guy that we met, and it stays with me to this day, who later died during the Civil War. He was a militia leader, very, very impressive guy. And I remember asking him, why are you doing this? Why are you suffering such depredation, taking the risk of losing your life, all of these things? And he looked at me and our group that was there, and he said, because I've heard my voice for the first time. What a powerful statement that is. And in a way, Syria has collectively heard its voice for the first time, and they're hearing it now. Despite the fact that the Syrian government under Bashar al-Assad, many people thought they quote unquote had won, but only control most of the major cities and about a third or half of the country. But they really did control it. I mean, most of these areas were outside of government control for well over a decade. And people started to hear their voices for the first time at the municipal level. They started to vote on what needs to be done. They protested in Idlib against HTS. Again, as I said earlier, when they had the morality police and other issues. So these are people that have heard their voices, that want to express their voices. That can't be put back into the can again. And HTS has to deal with. I said for years to Bashar al-Assad's officials, I said, you're going to have to deal with this. The old, net patronage network system you developed meticulously and your father developed over decades is shattered. It's gone. You have to develop a new patronage system. You have to listen to the people, and you're going to have a devolution of power. And they weren't willing to do that. That was one of his big mistakes. He had the opportunity to, while he had the advantage, to strike a power sharing deal that would put him in the catbird seat and his supporters with a weakened opposition, and he didn't do it because he wanted it all. Don't give up any power. That's the business as usual, the Syrian way under the Assads. It's very, very frustrating. And it happened in other venues as well, on Syrian-Israeli negotiations and so forth. But this is what HTS has to deal with now, or whatever group that emerges, whatever government and governance system emerges out of this, is they have to listen now. And people aren't going to just be told what to do as they had for, 50 years. And I think that's, to me, as much or more powerful a factor in all of this than the shade of Islam that the new government may practice, or what groups or what type of governance system in general they're going to have.
All right, I have a few more questions, and we'll try to open it up to the attendees and our guests. You've had a remarkable life so far, Dr. Lesch, and we're going to talk more a little bit about your upcoming bio toward the end. But one of the opportunities you had was to see if we could get Austin Tice back home. He is the former Marine turned journalist who's actually from Texas. He went to U of H, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah.
Who's been missing for almost 10 years and is held hostage there. I know you played a pivotal role in trying to bring him home and working with his parents. Can you share a little bit about that, and if you have any updates about Tice?
Sure. I mean, this morning I was going back and forth with U.S. government officials, international sources, and my dear friend Eric, who I know is tuning in right now, who's a lawyer in international affairs and very close to the Tice family. Mark and Deborah Tice, Austin's parents, live in Houston. I've been helping them out. I wouldn't say a pivotal role, but at times maybe, but helping them out for over a decade. They are forces of nature, and they, have met with President Biden, President Trump on several occasions, trying to get their son back. And it's been a whirlwind ride. There are some sources that say there's no way he's alive, but there are intelligence sources, intercepts from U.S. intelligence that suggest he is still alive, and such as that an intercept that said whoever was holding him, and we think the Syrian government or his proxies were holding them this whole time, had taken him to a hospital in Beirut for treatment. That there was one intercept regarding dental care. So this tells you several things. One, that the people who are holding him are interested in keeping him alive, which is very important, and keeping him well. And now there is this opportunity with the fall of the Assad government and the emptying of prisons and so forth to perhaps find out where he is, to gain more information. We're frantically trying to do this. The U.S. government contacts all over, and we're pursuing some very creative ways to try to get him back. But it would be a wonderful, wonderful story. And this is one of the things I think why Secretary of State Anthony Blinken had direct contact with HTS, even though they're still on the U.S. Terrorism list. One of the things he probably said, or I'm sure he said, is that, do you have any information on Austin Tice? Can you help us get him back, or find out more information on him? And if you do that, that will be a sign from the U.S. perspective that you are meeting words with deeds, that you are more moderate and pragmatic than your past. So it's been a collective effort of a lot of people, very creative people, and hopefully it has a wonderful ending. But we shall see.
You touched on Turkey and is mainly Turkey, but Israel is preoccupied with what's happening in Gaza and Lebanon. What is their how are they reacting to all this, and both politically, strategically, um, Turkey and Israel? How do you see how they fit into this equation?
Sure. Well, Turkey's the big winner, but so is Israel in many ways. I mean, let's put yourself in Israeli shoes. And as a Middle East scholar, historian, I try to get my students, put yourself in their shoes. Let's look at this. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is in power. They're former al-Qaeda. Many would say that, again, they're still in many ways al-Qaeda in the way they view the world and view Islam. Al-Qaeda, of course, is diametrically opposed to Israel. Israel is one of their mortal enemies. Look at the name, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Organization for the Liberation of Asham. Asham is the Levant, Greater Syria, which traditionally, before the nation-state system came in, post-World War I period, includes Lebanon, parts of Turkey, Jordan, and Israel. You mentioned, and we talked about the nom de guerre of Ahmed Sarah, the head of HTS. His nom de guerre was Abu Muhammad al-Jalani. Al-Jalani in Syrian Arabic is the Golan, and refers to the Golan Heights. He adopted that name to seem as if it was more of that he was more Syrian nationalist than anything else. But the return of the Golan has been the sine qua non, the indispensable fact of Syrian foreign policy and in many ways domestic policy ever since they lost it in 1967, certainly under the Assads. So Israel's keenly aware of these things. So they're taking a wait and see approach, and then they're doing what any state does. They have the strategic upper hand right now by a large degree after weakening Hezbollah and Hamas, after Iran being weakened because of all this, after Assad falling. And any country that has such a strategic upper hand, they're going to take advantage of it, and that's what they're doing. And they're moving into the Golan itself, taking over areas that had been part of the what had been the assiduously observed UN ceasefire agreement from 1974, following the '73 Arab-Israeli War, and taking over certain those areas, taking over the high ground around Mer Hermon that looks over most of Syria in terms of surveillance. And they're making sure, because they don't know about like us, we're waiting and seeing about HTS. We're waiting to see if this whole thing will fall apart. Will it become a failed state, and terrorist groups or groups that are opposed to the West and Israel, will they implant themselves in Syria? So Israel is doing what a country like in its position does, and so it's bombed remaining, or what they have found, in terms of remaining Syrian armaments, the Syrian Navy in Latakia. Of course, they've been basically unimpeded, in an unimpeded fashion, been carrying out attacks in Syria for several years, basically degrading Hezbollah and Iranian positions, which they were most worried about. They weren't really at the Syrian government. Syrians got killed because they happened to be in the same room, but that was about it. But So Israel is making sure that these armaments and weapons and so forth, any sort of remaining chemical weapons that may still exist in Syria, make sure they don't get into the hands of any groups should HTS turn out not to be what we all hope, or if the country implodes and you have the opportunity for, again, outside countries to come in and interfere. So that's what Israel is doing, whether you agree with it or not. Turkey, of course, they're the gatekeeper now. Russia kind of was, and Iran to a certain degree, but Russia was the gatekeeper until this point. But Turkey is the big winner in this. And their main objectives in Syria now, or as they have been, is the border, getting Syrian refugees from Turkey, which has been a political problem in Turkey, back into Syria, and to make sure that the Kurds in Syria are pushed as far east as possible and off the border with Turkey and are weakened as much as possible. Something that could, of course, cause some problems and has caused problems with the United States. But Turkey's the gatekeeper. I mean, I had a friend of mine in who's been observing what's going on in Damascus, and he said, the Turkish officials are already arriving and they're already walking around as if they own the place. Well, they kind of do. They have the most influence right now with HTS. HTS and Turkey didn't always get along, but Turkey supports a number, it largely supports them. They support some of the groups associated with them, especially the Syrian National Army in the north. And but with this comes responsibility, and therefore Turkey has to play a role, an important role, and they'll probably have, of all the outside powers, the most important role in helping this current government in Syria, led by HTS, to transition to something more stable that, in the long run, will help Turkey as well, economically, politically, and strategically.
Okay, I have just one more question about U.S. policy because that's an important one to address. And then if you're listening and if you have a question, we may have some issues with the chat and the Q&A feature. You may have to just raise your hand, and I'll have to call on you. So bear with us for that. But Dr. Lesch, can you talk a little bit about US's role, and we're also in transition from administration to administration. Are there personal relationships that you know of with the incoming administration? Are there or personal ties? Are there any strategic opportunities for the US, particularly with Russia in the game?
Yeah. Yeah, the U.S. is in a difficult position right now because, as I said, HTS is branded by the U.S. as a terrorist organization, also by the UN and the EU. And so, in one sense, we're wait and see approach, as I mentioned earlier. Are these guys really going to be pragmatic and moderate as they say they are? There have been discrete contacts with HTS on a variety of issues. The EU maybe reestablishing its embassy. France reestablished its embassy. And the question for the U.S. right now is do we lift the sanctions? There's widespread and very deep U.S. Sanctions that the EU and other countries have signed on that really crippled the Assad government, but also crippled all of Syrian society in many ways. And do we start lifting these sanctions, particularly certain institutions in Syria, like the central bank, for instance, or other government ministries that can help with keeping, as I keep saying, the lights on and public services going, and the banking system start to deal with this new economic environment, and so that Syria can start to rebuild and reconstruct. Because if these sanctions are on and if they are followed, these are second and third party sanctions, and basically no one that are unless you're Russia or China or Iran, for instance, or even China, they don't want to do business in Syria because they'll run afoul of the U.S. Treasury Department. So we could have waivers on these things, temporary. So these are the things we're looking at right now in terms of what we can do. And I think that the question is, and I know they're talking about this in Washington, is do you sit back and wait and see, or do you help shape things? Do you involve yourself to a certain degree to help shape the I don't want to say behavior, but shape this new structure that's emerging in Syria. And I think there are arguments in both directions, but I think you can find a balance between these things. And I think a number of sanctions should be lifted in the near term to get to allow for international aid and help beyond humanitarian aid going into Syria, and particularly reconstruction aid from the Arab Gulf countries, which will be very important.
All right, I'm going to open this up. Harar Balian has a question, and I do want to keep some time at the very end to talk about the 2025 book that Catherine Nixon Cook has written. So we're going to open it up. Harar, if you could, if you have your question, if you could please go ahead and ask.
Thank you, Armin. Thank you, David, for this presentation. Learned a lot, really. I learned a lot from your presentation. I have two questions. One is about expectations, in particular, Western expectations from a country like Syria that has seen nothing but dictatorship. Expectations that a country like this can transform into an ideal democratic place overnight. I'm being sarcastic, but you understand.
I know you are.
As we have dealt with this for the last 13
Yes, we have.
uprising and the Western expectations as to what would really help Syria move forward and ease, at the very least, ease sanctions, is not lift sanctions. That's, how to temper this Western expectations is my first question. Second question is, as we know, for the last 13, 14 years of civil war in Syria, most of the minorities, if not all of the minorities in Syria, have stood by Assad as their only protection in a country gone into very deep chaos. How to prevent the new rulers of Syria from taking revenge on the minorities in Syria? And the reason I'm asking this question is because I hear from Syrians, minority members of Syrians, who are scared to death that the nice words that HTS is giving them now are just nice words to get over these initial steps, and then the revenge will come. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rare, very much. Good to hear from you. And Rare and I have been through the wars together, literally and figuratively. You're right. I mean, the West really needs to temper its expectations regarding Syria. Syria as a whole has very little, if any, experience with democracy. We can't make the same mistakes that we made in Iraq and Afghanistan that says if you have an election, you're a democracy. That's anything but the case. Democracy is a messy business. It took the United States a long time in its own civil war to develop a somewhat stable democracy, and even now, we have challenges to that. And it takes a long time from the ground up, civil society, educational levels, economic growth, all of these things, and that hasn't happened in Syria, and Syria is a mess right now. As I mentioned earlier, economically, it's divided, it's sectarian, which feeds into your second question about minorities. And, during the civil wars, as you well know, Herrera, when the state fails, when you have without governance, people tend to retreat into their sectarian fortresses, their ethnic and sectarian fortresses, whether they be religious or whatever. And that's what happened. And there was a lot of blood spilled. Civil wars are particularly nasty, and there is going to be some retribution. You can't help, but expect some of that. Can they control it? And this is the thing, there's this balance, everyone's saying they need to, disarm the militias, and disband the HTS military element. and but yet you need something in order to you need some wherewithal to restore order and keep order and protect minority populations. And I'll tell you a story. I may have told you this before here, but I think the audience might enjoy hearing it. One of these Syrian opposition guys we met, another one that I interviewed, and tremendously impressive individual, loves Spanish opera and all of these things. And we interviewed him in Gaziantep, and we asked him that question. And he was a Sunni Muslim, not real conservative, but it could be categorized as a Salafist, I imagine. And we asked him, "What are you going to do if you win? Are you going to kill all the Alawites?" And as the minority group that Bashar al-Assad represents and is in power, has been in power. And he looked at me and he said, "This morning I just executed a member of the Syrian armed forces. He took a gun to his head and shot him, and he was a Sunni Muslim." And of course, we were like, "Okay," but he was telling us it doesn't matter, what religion they follow, what brand of Islam or whatever. Is at the time they were the opposition. So if they presumably the flip side of that, if they cooperate and so forth, maybe that'll happen. I have doubts. There's after things quote unquote settle down, if they ever settle down, I think the minority communities have a right to be fearful, and this has to be addressed. They have to be protected, and if not, they're going to leave en masse. A number of them already are. A number of them already left. Half the country was displaced either internally or externally during the Civil War. But they're going to leave, and then you have even more brain drain and skill set leaving the country and money leaving the country. So this is one of the things that has to be implemented as soon as possible. And I think having a simple declaration of principles, and then the wherewithal, and it might take. I know everyone's saying this is a Syrian process owned by Syria and led by Syria, and yes, it should be in terms of what type of system they should develop, but they don't have the wherewithal to protect everybody. They don't control the whole country yet. Will it devolve into a cantonization of Syria into all these different sections that have a predominant religious or ethnic element, such as the Kurds in the Northeast, Druze in the South, Alawites in the Northwest. So there may have to be an international component in terms of peacekeeping forces, UN-led or maybe Arab Gulf-led, since they're mostly Sunni, and that would be more acceptable to this Sunni-led government. But that's something that needs to happen, I think, sooner rather than later, because as you point out, you start seeing these killings happening, revenge killings and retribution, a lot of people are going to start questioning the bona fides of HTS-led government, including the international community, and the hope for sanctions relief.
All right, we're going to have to keep these rapid fire. We got a few minutes left, and we have 6 people who've raised their hands. So please keep your comments to a sentence if you could get to your question as soon as possible. Zubaida, please ask your question.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much. I have so many things to say, but since you said just one question, I first just want to say very quick how my heart is broken with what happened in Syria. And I totally agree with many things the professor said, and I think he expected me to raise my hand and talk. I don't agree with what you said about Bashar being in Russia. I think he's either captured or killed. I spent the last 10 years of my life traveling to Syria, and I met the president 6 times. I know the man, he will not run. You can say anything about him, but he will not run this way. And just to comment on what you said about he thought the people loved him. No, maybe at the beginning in 2004, he thought the people loved him, but he knew the people didn't love, he knew the reality, in the last couple of years. I will never go back to Syria. I am more scared than the Alawite. I'm a Sunni, but people like me have been silenced. I cannot even open my mouth and say anything about Syria right now. This government does not represent me. Anyone who you're talking about Syria very, it's not so simple. There's Israel, there's Turkey, there's everything going on around. I just don't think that this new government will be representing me ever, and I'll be more scared to go to Syria now or ever. I don't think this is ever going to be resolved. And I just wish that people look at this country from the way we look at it. Everything is gone.
Can you get to the question? I'm really sorry. Can you get to your
Yeah,
question?
Armin, if I can respond to what Zubaida said.
yeah,
First of all, Zubaida, I happen to know that Bashar is in Moscow. He's there with his children and his wife, who is in the hospital right now, and his father-in-law. So he did get out. How he got out is there are different narratives regarding that. As far as people loving him, as I said earlier, that was in his own mind. And that's the important thing. He thought that. And I saw that up close and personal. And, for a time, there was genuine, he had some genuine support. I remember interviewing a Hezbollah official during the Civil War, early in the Civil War. And a lot of the military leaders of the Syrian opposition. And a turning point for them was Bashar's March 30th, 2011 speech, just after the uprising broke out, his first speech that addressed the nation in the Syrian parliament. And I thought personally it was very disappointing. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying I was disappointed, which got me persona non grata in his mind for a long time. But it was a speech that was, it didn't recognize the opposition or the uprising. It blamed outside forces, terrorism, all of these things. And every single opposition leader I spoke to, the guys fighting and dying in Syria, they said that was the moment. That was the moment when we said, there's no way. Any little hope we had, and a lot of people had hope when he came in, as you know, and as you said, when he came to power. But any little strand of hope that we had is gone. And so we're going to have to fight. And I had a Hezbollah official very much allied and pro-Bashar saying the same thing. If he had stuck with the people, he maybe could have prevented the civil war from happening. I mean, easy for us armchair historians to say that. We're not ones with guns to our head in terms of taking action, which would obviously elicit a great deal of opposition from people around him in his inner circle. But it's one of the sad stories. This is what separates the good leaders from the great leaders. When you have these moments, and there were moments, he decided to do business as usual. And the people I knew in Syria, and it's been a lot of time in Syria during his first 10 years in power, they gave him a long learning curve. And we're hopeful, and there were a few things now and then that provided some hope, especially very, very early on, as you mentioned. But it's a shame, and it's a very sad story because things could have been different had he really led and not done, as I said, business as usual. Thanks, Zubair.
We're going to take one more, and I see you, Mehmet, David, Anissa. When we follow up with the recording and the survey, we'll have Dr. Lesch's email so you could ask him direct questions. Hopefully not to get your inbox full, but
thanks, Armin. No, I'm happy to.
I mean, it's on Trinity's website, but
yeah, I know.
We'll share that. But let's say since we started a few minutes late because of my technical issues, I'll have one more question. Amina, please ask the question so that we could have Dr. Lesch respond appropriately.
Hi, Dr. Lesch. I just have two really quick questions. So my first question is about the axis of resistance and how I know they're opposed to like Sunni Islamist militant groups. So how do you think that Syria's, I guess, new move away from the axis of resistance will impact the regional politics and relationships within the region? And then my second question is, do you think that the Idlib government, like how it was ran by HTS, will be a precursor, or I guess sort of show how they're going to run Syria as a whole, or are there like too many other factors at play to say that the Idlib government will show us how they're going to run Syria as a whole?
Sure. Hi, Lena. Thanks for your questions. Well, the axis of resistance isn't much of an axis right now. Hezbollah has been devastated. Hamas has been devastated by Israel. Syria, which was the key, by far, strategic ally of Iran in the heartland of the Middle East, first and foremost, because it was the connection to resupply and resupply Hezbollah. It put Iran on the front lines of the heartland of the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli dispute, all of these things. That's been shattered. Iran still has predominant influence in Iraq. There are some that worry that having been so weakened, will Iran just jump toward developing a nuclear weapon as their last form of deterrence since this axis of resistance, which was as much a defensive mechanism as it was an offensive mechanism, a deterrent to Israel. Israel, if you attack us, we're going to unleash Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis and so forth, which kind of occurred to a certain degree after October 7th last year and the Israeli invasion of Gaza. We hope that doesn't happen. The new U.S. government coming into power, there's, I tend to think that President Trump is someone that wants the deal. Getting a deal is most important to him. He never said he was against the nuclear agreement. He was against the Obama nuclear agreement with Iran. And he always said, I could get a better deal. Well, now, of course, if the deal can happen, he can probably get a better deal because Iran is so much weakened. And that's, I think, very attractive to Trump because he can say, I did something that Obama, I did something better than Obama. I did something that Biden couldn't do. Similar with maybe getting a deal in Gaza, maybe getting a deal in the Ukraine. He's all about this. Of course, that famous book, The Art of the Deal. So the axis of resistance is, not much of an axis anymore. Iran is the big loser in this in terms of regional or international powers, along with Russia. Not just loss of prestige and reputation, but the loss of a key strategic asset. Now, as far as Idlib, I spoke about that a bit earlier, so I don't want to repeat myself too much. I think, on the one hand, they do have some administrative experience and some civilian bureaucrats who have been transferred now to Damascus. So that's not a bad thing. But Idlib is much different than all of Syria or even a large portion of Syria. That's the big question. How they ruled in Idlib, is it digestible for the rest of the Syrian population and the international community? And that might not be the case. Again, they're saying and doing the right things, but this isn't something that we can answer right now. Come back to me in 3 months, 6 months, a year from now, if they're still the dominant element in the Syrian government. And then we'll see what happens. It's not transferable, A to A, and in my mind, particularly with the minority elements in Syria and the fact that a good bit of Syria, is very, very secular and not nearly as religious as HTS and its cohorts. So that's something that has to be reconciled. They said again, they're saying the right things, but time will tell.
Thank you, Dr. Lesch, Mehdi, and David and Sherry. Sorry we couldn't get to your questions. It is a little after 1. I do want to say that we'd love to do an in-person program because of the holidays and Dr. Lesch's understandably crazy schedule during this time. We wanted to bring you this program and then follow it up once things perhaps, I don't know if settle down is a word that are words we could use for the Middle East. I do want to talk about your book coming out. Catherine Nixon Cook has a book coming out called Dodgers to Damascus, David Lesch's unique journey from baseball to the Middle East. It'll be published in 2025, and I think we will do program on that, but if you could give a little teaser about that book, I think your injury with respect to you being injured, which was a horrible thing at the time, but we wouldn't have had such an expert like you to we have such a gift here in San Antonio to have you. But share with us a little bit about that book and what people should expect.
Well, you should ask Catherine Nixon Cook, and I'm honored that she chose to write a biography on me and thought my life was interesting enough to write a biography. I mean, it basically traces my life, and particularly, Dodgers to Damascus. I was the number one draft pick of the Los Angeles Dodgers in 1980 in the winter draft. They had two drafts at the time, and played for a couple of years until a rotator cuff injury took me in a completely different direction, and eventually toward Middle East studies. And of course, we detail much greater, obviously, than what we went over today. My time in Syria, meeting consistently with Bashar al-Assad, some very hairy moments in Syria, some adventures that that Catherine, writes so beautifully and makes me look really good, and all sorts of some other things in which I've been involved, and it's been kind of a weird thing from my point of view. But Catherine has done such a great job. It's basically finished, the manuscript, and as you said, it'll be published by Trinity University Press in August of 2025.
That's how different the world would be had Assad stayed an ophthalmologist, or had Lesch become a Dodger.
Yeah, well, it's funny. That's one of the things that connected us in the beginning, is that he had a change of professions, a drastic change, as did I, in a much different way, obviously. But you have to recalculate, recalibrate, and move on.
Dr. David Lesch, who is a professor, an Ewing also distinguished professor of history at Trinity University. He's got many books out. We're going to send the links to the two books. I don't know if we did that earlier, but two books on Syria. He also has this almost like the Bible of the politics of the Middle East. You can't see it because it's backwards, but this is a really good read, an in-depth look at the rise of Islam in the Middle East by Dr. Lesch. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate not only you being a San Antonian, but you giving support to the World Affairs Council. We appreciate your time. We will send his info out. We'll send the recording out. Thank you for everyone's patience, and thank you for tuning in. Join us on January the 25th. We will have the former prison guard of the late Nelson Mandela here in San Antonio, Mr. Christo Brand. He will be here, and we're partnered with our friends from Students of Service. And then the following week, we will have Wayne Peacock, the CEO of USAA, at our annual meeting. Both are Dream Week events. And then, of course, our International Citizen of the Year with Jim Pershbach. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your patience. Merry Christmas, happy holidays. We'll see you in 2025.
Thank you.
Take care.